Okay. Okay, so let's do a little recap, and I want to reiterate something we ended off with last week and you had to rush a bit. But it's important to discuss this for a bit as we go forward. So we read the introduction, and the introduction was basically the Rambam talked about why he's writing this, who he's writing it for, and essentially he's writing this because the importance of the topic itself is crucial, and B, there are some cryptic passages and that require explanation. So he put an introduction, an 8-chapter introduction to Pirkay Avot, to ethics of our fathers, to give keys and overarching rules as to how the person operates. And then as you go through ethics of our fathers, you kind of get a moral guide or moral ideas. Now, what we discussed last week is that the Rambam is stating that there's only one human soul. And unlike some doctors, the Rambam cites, that believed there was more than one soul because they saw different functions in the person's life. And therefore, they assumed or they prescribed each function a different soul. And again, when we say the word soul, the Hebrew word is nefesh. We don't mean a spiritual entity. We mean more like just your vitality. You feel alive. And people identified 3 elements to that. The psychological, like your cognizance, it's one. The other one was you feel vital, like your sentience. You feel like you touch your fingers, you feel alive. And the third was that you can grow. That's the way doctors split them into 3 categories. And now I'm saying there are 1. And when you say that the soul has parts, it doesn't mean it's comprised of elements. It doesn't mean, that it's parts of like a table where you can break it apart. It's parts as in, it's one singular entity that has multiple functions. And therefore these functions seem as part because the coming together or comprising all these functions together create the totality of the soul of the nefesh. Now, we compared this to Chassidus, which of course in time has 2 souls. We kind of rushed through this, but I want to elaborate a bit. The 2 souls described in Nefesh Abahamis, the animal soul. Now, the animal soul in Tanya, Nefesh Abahamis, that's what it's usually referred to as, has 3 names. Nefesh Abahamis, animal soul, Nefesh Achiyunis, vital soul, and Nefesh Ativis, natural soul. They all mean one and the same thing. But they convey different elements of being a biological human creature. When you say Bahamas, an animal, what you mean is that in the same way animals want to eat, sleep, and procreate, humans want to eat, sleep, and procreate. But there's that same biological me that wants to do those things is also my vital me, and therefore it's called chiyunis, and it's also my natural me. And depending on the context, in Tanya, the Alter will use different names, but they really mean one thing. So we could describe that as the human soul. There's another element discussed a bit less in Tanya to this human soul, and that is sichlis, the intellectual capacity of the human soul. It's discussed a little bit less in Tanya for whatever reason, but it's there as well in Chassidus. Now, I mentioned to you that the Tzemach Tzedek in his commentary to Tanya writes that when the Rambam here, in these Shemona Perokim, these 8 chapters, states that the person has one soul, and not a bunch, he's referring to the human or / animal soul. We'll call it the human soul. He's referring to the human soul, not the godly soul. And that the human soul is only one, which is comprised of all these things: my natural instinct, my intelligence, my vitality, the fact that I grow. That's all part of me being a human being. And therefore, I suggested, based on what the Tzemach Tzedek said, that the Alter, that Rambam is only talking about the human soul that the Alter talks about, that Tanya talks about. So I suggested, and this will kind of frame a little bit as we go forward, that in these Shemona Perokim, in these 8 chapters, in the Rambam's moral, ethical description of building moral character, it's talking about building yourself as a human being. And therefore, that's what he focuses on, is on the human soul. Because he talks about you being a human being. Whereas the Alter Rebbe, in Tanya, Chassidus, is already talking to a fully formed, mature human adult. And now, Tanya wants to bring you to a godly place. So in a sense, this is what I said last week, Tanya begins where the 8 chapters end. It's almost like built human moral, ethical character. You're an upstanding human being. You know how to control yourself. You know how to use your human self in a healthy manner. Now you can develop into a loftier godly space. And if that's correct, it would explain why the Rambam does not mention anything of the godly soul here, because he's just talking about the human experience. Whereas the Alter Rebbe is talking about after a complete human experience, now we're going to the godly. Now that was all part 1 of chapter 1. And now we go here. So you can see the words va'ata. Now, this next paragraph is going to further solidify my contention, if you will. Okay, va'ata yadeya, now you know, shetikun amidus, correcting one's character, one's midas are character traits, attributes. Here they translate as moral qualities. Hu refuas nefesh. This is healing of the nefesh, of the soul, the kocheseh, and its capacities. Just like a doctor, asher yiper hagufes, which is there to heal bodies. Before he starts healing the body, he has to know haguf, the body, asher yarapeu kula v'chelka mahem. He has to know the totality of the body and what that body is made up of, and then he can start to healing it. In the case of a doctor of the human body, he has to know the human body. Sorry, just pause for a second. And therefore the doctor must know what are the things that would cause the body sickness and want to be careful of them, and what are the things that will make the body healthy, and he should direct the person to engage in those healthy behaviors. The same thing is true of the Reifa, the doctor of the nefesh, of the soul, the human psychology, of the human cognizance, and therefore one who wants to perfect their character traits, their moral standing. He has to know the outline of what the nefesh is made up of, the chelka and its components, what is going to be damaging and detrimental to this nefesh, and what is going to make it healthy. Now here's already an interesting thing, and this is very important to know, in that mental health, the Rambam is putting it here right here, is equal to physical health. So right from the beginning, in the same way a person doesn't feel embarrassed because he has a broken leg. Nothing's wrong with a person if he broke his leg. It's just the way life is. Breaks his leg and got to get it fixed. Or he's born with a disease, God forbid. No one looks at him any less because of that. It's just the way God made the person from birth, and then he has to deal with it in the way that he has to deal with it. A person should view mental health the same way. There's a nefesh. A person has a mental capacity, his moral character, and he has a body. And a body needs a body doctor, a person who understands the body, how it works, and what its components are, and which foods to avoid, and which foods to eat, and which things to do, and which things not to do that's healthy or detrimental for the body. And likewise with the soul, same thing. That's the first thing. The second thing is, in the same way, a body requires constant maintenance. You have to feed it. You have to give it rest. You have to exercise it. There's all the things you have to do to maintain a healthy body. The same thing's true of the nefesh. You can't leave it alone and just assume, I'm a good person, and that's the end of it. You have to treat both guf and nefesh as exactly the same. The doctor has to view it that way, and so does the patient, which is already an interesting, forward-thinking idea from the Rambam already in the second paragraph here. And they continues. And therefore, I'll say, shechelkei nefesh, that the parts of the nefesh, heim chamisha, are 5. Hazon, the part of the nefesh which ingests food, and this is also called the growing, the fact that I can grow, physically grow. Margish, the sensitive. Madama, the imaginative. The part of me that desires. And the rational, the cognizance. So the fact that I eat/grow, number 1. Number 2, my sensation, the fact that I can touch. Number 3, my imagination or memory, as he's going to explain soon. Misorder is the drive, appetite for whatever it is, as we'll explain soon. And the rational, the intellectual part of me. Those are the 4 components of the nefesh. We already started stating earlier in the chapter, our words and our intention here in this 8 chapters is only for the human nefesh. The capacity that I have to ingest food, for example, is not the same as the capacity that a donkey or a horse has to eat. Because man is sustained by the part of the nefesh of the human nefesh, the human soul that can ingest food and that can eat food. And the donkey is sustained by the part of the nefesh, the part of the soul that can sustain, that can eat food. Of the donkey. And likewise, the tamar is a palm tree, will drink water or consume the rays of the sun from the nefesh that it has. Now, the reason why he's saying this is because we mentioned before that there were some doctors who believed that there were different parts to the soul. And one of the parts of the soul is to eat and grow. And if you were to believe that the person is comprised of 3 different souls, eat and grow is one, my vital self is another, my rational is another, then one might think, that in the same way I eat, and a donkey eats, and a palm tree eats, we all have the same eating soul. But in addition to an eating soul, I also have a vital soul. Well, maybe that's the same as a donkey, because a donkey is also vital. But in addition to that, I have a intellectual soul. And the reason why the Rambam thinks this is a mistake, and I think I alluded to this last week, is because if you think that way, then that would mean you have no control over your vital self. You have no control over the way you eat. You only have control over your intellectual self, because the same way a donkey eats, you eat. It's the same eating soul. But because the Rambam says no, a human being has one singular soul, a bunch of components. One of the components is it can eat. A donkey has one singular donkey soul, bunch of components. One of the components is it can eat. Therefore, my eating is as it is part of the component of being a human soul. And a donkey's eating is part of is a component of the donkey soul. And therefore, do not compare the eating of a human to the eating of a donkey, even though we both happen to eat. Because we don't have a bunch of different souls, and that we have the same, human beings and animals have an eating soul, all the same one. We all have a vital soul, all the same one. And the human being has another soul called the intellectual soul. That would mean that your vital and eating self, you can't control. You can only control your intellectual self. And for the Rambam, that's out of the question. For the Rambam, you only have one soul that you can control, as he'll explain how in the coming chapters. But it's important for him to reiterate this point, that you have one soul, but you're comprised of components. And therefore, even though you eat the same way a donkey does, the donkey eats as part of the donkey soul, and the human being eats as part of the human being soul. And therefore, he goes on to say, and therefore, we will call all of these different people, all of these different things, the donkey, the horse, the human being, and the palm tree. We're going to say that they all get fed, they all share the same name, just in title, and that they all have the same description. We all consume. Not because our consumption is all the same. And therefore, so too we might say, Allah Adam on a human being, and animals. We might say, well, donkeys can touch, I can touch, we both touch. And therefore says the Rambam, you're only using that term in that we share a common description, but not that not that the sensation of human being, that's the same sensation every other animal has. And the feeling, the sensation that this species is an independent sense of sensation, different to another. In other words, tigers have their version of sensation because they have a tiger nefesh, and animal and dogs and horses have their nefesh, and they each have their own independent version of consuming and sensation. Each and every species, whatever it is, nefesh yeshloi, nefesh, any species that has a nefesh, that has a vital soul, meaning animals, yeshloi nefesh achas bilti nefesh acher. They each have an independent type of nefesh, different than the other. And their nefesh, the nefesh of a donkey, and the nefesh of a horse, and the nefesh of a dog, compels certain actions, certain things it can do. And that nefesh of the donkey will have a bunch of other capacities that it can do that maybe a human being can't do. One of those capacities that the donkey has is to eat and touch. And we happen to share those actions. Therefore, we can compare the actions or like the manifestations in that they're the things that the soul can do may be similar between one soul and another, between a human and an animal. We both can walk, we both can touch. And therefore, and you might therefore think that the actions, my capacity to touch, is independent of the rest of my being because I share that with an animal. An animal can also touch. Says the Rambam, don't think that way. It's very much not that way. It comes from the human version of dog sensation, comes from the dog version of sensation. Now, Moshe Baza, a parable to re-illustrate this, like you're really honing this thing in. It seems like it was a prevalent way of thinking at the time in dividing the human soul into a bunch of different categories. I'm not 100% sure, but I think he could be making a reference to this old Greek idea that the human being was like a person riding a chariot that has two horses. There's like the intellectual self is like the person riding the carriage, and then he has different tendencies symbolized by the two horses. And the person, the intellectual self, has to control the two horses to make sure that they stay straight. And in that philosophy, there's only a certain ability you can control of yourself because you only really have capacity of your rational self because the two horses, the other parts of you are out of your control. And I think this was, I'm not mistaken, I think maybe the philosophers here know better, but I think this was a prevalent idea in Greek philosophy, and the Rambam's coming to negate that idea. Greek philosophy was very popular in the Arab world at the time. And I think the Rambam's coming to negate that idea and say, no, it's not as if you're made up of a bunch of different parts, and some parts you can control and other parts you can't. It's one you. And you happen to have similarities with other species that can also eat and also touch and also walk. The parable for this, we're over here. The three dark places. One of these three dark places, the sun is shining and there's light. And another location has light from the moon. And the third, has a candle and it's burning. It's true that all three of those locations have light. The reason for this place having light, it's the result of the sun. And the other location has light because of the moon. And the other location has light because of the fire, because of the flame. What he's saying is, just because you say all three places are light, it doesn't mean that the reason why they're light is the same thing. This one's light from the sun, this is light from the moon, and this is light from the candle. Likewise, just because humans, animals, and fish eat, don't say that they all have the same eating. No, the human's eating because he's a human being, from the human soul. The animal's eating because the animal soul in its particular species, and the fish, and likewise the plant or whatever else that has this vitality, this nefesh, that requires it to consume. Therefore, the fact that a human being has sensation is because he's a human being and it comes from a singular nefesh as a human being. And the reason why the donkey has sensation, the reason why the donkey can feel the ground that it's walking on, is because it has a singular nefesh of a donkey. And the fact that the eagle can touch or feel things. Is because it has a unique nefesh for eagles. There's nothing that would put in idle. That we all have this thing called sensation. Understand this thing because it's very crucial. Many philosophers make the mistake with this, and because they make the mistake in thinking that we're made up of a bunch of different souls, and our eating is the same thing as every other animal that eats, and our touching is the same thing as every other animal that touches, philosophers make big mistakes in that regard. And again, I think, as I mentioned before, I think the reason is because that would mean certain parts of me are out of my control. And for the Rambam, that's, number one thing is you can control yourself. And understanding that you have one being, so using your mind, as we'll see soon, you can control the rest of your experience as well. Now, therefore, components of the human experience, the human nefesh, and I'll say, which he said before was 5. The eating was 1. Let's go back up and we can see what the 5 components were. He's going to go through each one to explain what they are. The eating / growing, sensation, the fact I can touch things, imagination / memory, presence. Those are the 5 elements of the human nefesh. So let's go through each one of them at a time. And if we'll return to the subject matters of the components of the soul, the components of the nefesh, and I'll say, the eating capacity, the nutritive capacity, the fact that I can consume food, includes the fact that I'm drawn to eating certain foods, the fact that I can contain these food, I can digest these foods, and the fact that my body can differentiate between healthy and unhealthy food and put to waste the unhealthy parts of the food and retain the nutrition, and that which makes me grow, and the fact that I can procreate, something that's just like me, I can create another human being, and that which separates and divides nutritious drink or liquids from unnutritious liquids, so that the soul, the nefesh, my living self, has the capacity to retain, to keep that which it needs to sustain itself, and that which has to be pushed out to waste. And these 7 capacities of the eating, of the digest, of the zon, of the nefesh that consumes, growing, and all the different parts of digestion and wanting food, taste, appetite, all that. How they operate, and what they all do and how they operate, and which limbs of the body do they operate in, is more well known and more well understood. And a person can find out about these all the time because they're doctors. Believe that for those who are doctors, because that's their field. This part of the nefesh is not for us, because we are dealing with moral character, not with digestion. So doctors in medicine, which parts of the body are, etc. Okay, so that was a brief overview of the digestive self, namely the fact that I can procreate, digest food, and all the details that go around with that, and the fact that I'm drawn towards food. That's the zon, the nefesh, the nefesh that sustains, or the capacity the nefesh has to sustain me in the physical sense. And therefore that is primarily physical. Leave that for doctors. Part 2. This is the sensation, the part of the nefesh that can feel, I can touch things. These are the well-known 5 senses that everybody knows about. The fact that I can see, the fact that I can hear, the fact that I can taste, the fact that I can smell, and the fact that I can touch, the 5 senses. Touching exists throughout the entire body. It doesn't have a particular limb that does touching. Any part of the body can touch. Like the other 4 do. The eyes are for seeing, the ears are for hearing, tongue for tasting, and nose for smell, but touching sensation is throughout the rest of the body. Okay, so again, this is mostly for doctors because this is a question of the physical part of the human experience of the nefesh. Now we start getting closer to the nefesh as we know it, the soul. Okay. This capacity of the soul for imagination. Now, I said before, imagination / memory. And the reason is because when I read imagination, I was like, what is he talking about? That's a whole part of my soul called imagination. So I skipped ahead, and here he explains what it is, that it's kind of a memory type thing. It's the part of the brain that filters between what's important to remember and what's not important to remember. So it comprehends certain things and interacts with certain things in the world. You consume information via the senses mentioned before, and then your brain has to filter what are the things that are important to remember and what are the things not. And therefore the brain will connect some parts of one memory with other parts of another memory, and remove certain parts of one memory and move it from another memory. And therefore a person can concoct in his mind by combining a bunch of things he's aware of into something else. And therefore he can come up with ideas that he never had before. This is where imagination comes in. In other words, the Rambam is telling us the reason why he's calling it the imagination faculty is because imagination is by memory. You can't imagine something that doesn't exist or that you've never seen. You can only imagine things by combining things you already know of and you've already experienced. So say, for example, you want to imagine a monster. So you've seen a spider, fine. You know what the concept of big is. Combine the two. Combine spider with big, and boom, now you got a spider that doesn't exist. Now, if you want to make the spider look a little freaky, you can take other things you've experienced before. You know what a lion looks like. You know what a horse looks like. You know what a fish looks like. Combine a bunch of elements from different things, put them together, and now in your imagination, you have this very scary-looking creature. Imagination, says the Rambam, is linked to your memory because you cannot conceive of something that does not exist or that you haven't experienced. And therefore he says a person, he can combine memories and, take one piece of memory from here and combine it with another memory from there and come up with nyanim shalei sigum klal. You can come up with things you've never come up with before. And there are things that you can't even comprehend. Like for a person, for example, imagining Sfinas Barzel, a iron boat, Ratza Ba'aver, flying in the air. We actually have that nowadays. We have an airplane. But this is what the Rambam is talking about, where something that doesn't exist, but a person can imagine it. He knows what flying is because he's seen a bird. He knows what a boat is because he's seen that. So he combines the two. He takes a boat and makes it fly in his imagination. Now, here's the beautiful thing. The Rambam I don't think he intended in saying this because it happened so many thousands of years later, or not thousands, centuries later, hundreds of years later. But it's interesting to note that all human inventions, there's nothing truly novel. It's all combining things that already exist. It's a discovery, really, not so much a novelty. The novelty is in the discovery. So you discover certain components and you combine with other components and you remove certain components from certain elements and then you combine other elements from other elements and you put them all together and now you have this wonder of scientific invention. But they're all things that already exist. Your mind cannot perceive that which does not exist or that which it hasn't experienced. And if the Rambam already centuries ago, imagine the idea of an airplane, because why not? You've seen a boat, you've seen a bird flying, combine the two in your mind. Now you have an imagination called a airplane. Now, of course, there's a genius who came along and figured out how to actually make it happen. But even the things you figure out how to make it happen, they're all from things that already exist. Which, sidebar, since we're doing comparative analysis of Chassidus, you've heard this from the Rabbi a number of times, that Chassidus makes the point that a person cannot make something out of nothing, and you can't make something into nothing. You can break something down to its most elemental state of being, but you cannot make it stop existing. You burn it all the way down, so it's been, the elements of whatever you burnt still exist. They just separated. The gas went to the smoke, and this went to there. I'm not really sure how it works, but they don't disappear. And likewise, when you create something, you didn't create something new from nothing. You've taken things that already exist, combined them, and made something new. And this is what the Rambam calls chelek hamadama, the imagination part of the soul. So it's imagination, it's memory, it's creativity, that whole part of me. Now, just a little joke that illustrates this point. There's a group of scientists who come to God and say, God, we figured out how to make man from the earth. We figured out your trick. God says, wow, impressive. Let's see it. And they bring God to the lab, and there's these huge, massive machines, and they're about to dump earth on one side, and the human being's going to come out on the other end. And just before they dump the earth into the machine, God says, whoa, hold on a second. Go get your own earth. In other words, all these, like we've been saying, all these inventions, they're not truly something from nothing. It's the chelek hamadama. It's what the Rambam here described as the imagination faculty, in that you can take things you've experienced, things you've understood and comprehended, combine them with each other, remove elements from certain things and combine with other elements till you finally have something new. This is true of your imagination. Certainly, putting it into practice, you can only use things you already have. Okay, so that's all a little sidetrack from the flying metal boat in the air, or the iron boat. Okay, likewise, you can imagine a person whose head's in the heaven, and his feet are on the ground, even though no such thing exists, but you can imagine it because you know what the idea of long is, you know what the idea of a human being is. In your brain, you can stretch it out and you can imagine it. You could also imagine an animal with 1,000 eyes, because why not? For example, and all these other things that are improbable or impossible. The imaginative, creative part of the nefesh, of the soul, can combine these things, and then he can create them in his imagination, in his fancy. Okay. Uvakan, I think we're going to conclude after the end of this paragraph because we're going to get to the appetitive and the drive, which is really the Rambam's focus. Because till now, even though the imaginative is still something that's in your control and still part of character building, it's going to become important as we go forward. The real crux of it comes in the next two, appetitive and the rational. So let's conclude this paragraph here. Uvakan to midbarim, and here now they translated it in the English here, mutakalim minum. I have no idea who this is. But in the Hebrew, midbarim is usually a reference to Arabs, if I'm not mistaken, like the desert people, I think. Anyway, maybe we'll check this up after. So, now this is where these people made this massive, terrible mistake. And as a result, they have all these terrible, wrong ideas built on this false premise. And they imagine the possible about things that are impossible. Or they made people think that they can imagine things and make them happen. Everything that's imaginable is possible to get done. And in other words, they took this idea from Rambam and went a step further. They argued, you can only imagine it if it exists. So if you can imagine a 1,000-eyed animal, then it must be that it exists. So either it exists somewhere and you don't know it, or you can will it into being, because you can't imagine something that doesn't exist. And says that it's not true. You can imagine things that don't exist, but they're comprised of components that you have experienced. They made the mistake of not realizing that imagination takes a bunch of small possibilities, combines them, and the totality, the sum total, could be something that's impossible, like a 1,000-eyed animal. But it doesn't mean that that thing actually exists because you are capable of imagining it. Okay, so to recap, we had the first three components of the nefesh, what the Rambam called the zon, the nefesh hazon, the part of the soul that nourishes, it grows, it procreates, it does the digestive system. That's for doctors, they'll deal with that. And then we went to the sensation, 5 senses, seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, and I'm missing one, tasting, right? And then from there we went to the imaginative. The imaginative is a combination of memory, creativity, and the brain's capacity to sort out memories. Now, I'm going to state this clearly, but I'm suggesting, and I could be wrong about this, but we know today that the brain has this capacity to filter memories that are not healthy for it, right? If a person remembered every single thing that they ever encountered, they would go crazy just from being bombarded with memories. It'd be too much information overload. It's a subconscious thing, but the brain does it. It filters out memories so that it doesn't overwhelm us with all that information. Because I'm sure there are people who suffer from this, where they have vivid memories of everything they've ever experienced, and it's very difficult. They feel like they're carrying the weight of all these memories around with them all the time. It's very, very damaging. Now, I'm going to say this clearly, but given the description of what he described, the imaginative, the medama, I'm suggesting that I think it's part of this part of the nefesh. In the same way, I can consciously choose to parse between memories and create new ideas based on combining and deconstructing memories. It could be that the subconscious part of this part of the nefesh does it automatically for us so that we can survive. And God willing, next week we get to the parts of me that are much more active in terms of building my character. The appetitive, the part of me that's, lust, appetite, the fact that I'm driven, and the other part, which is the rational / cognitive part of me. And as we'll see, all of these things are stacked upon each other. And we're going to see that for the Rambam, like a healthy mind includes a healthy body, includes healthy imagination. All the 5 layers have to be stacked upon each other healthily so that you can live a full, productive life, as we'll go on to see, God willing. Right, so you can unmute yourself at this point if you don't have any questions.
Great share. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Levi.
Thank you for joining.